Hello and welcome to part two of this introduction to Socket IO. In this video, we're going to cover how to get Socket IO set up on the client. And since we have previously set it up on the server, we'll be able to communicate back and forth between the client and server and do all kinds of fun things, such as getting this chat app to finally work. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, before we start jumping into the code on how to set Socket IO up on the client, let me just make a quick note about how we're handling auth on the server using some utility functions, mainly this sign token function, and it attaches a payload to the token that will end up including user information, specifically email, username, and ID. So when a user authenticates with this app, if you decode the JWT token, you will be able to get the user's email, username, and ID. And that'll play a role later when we start doing some stuff with Socket IO on the client and the server. All right, let's jump into it. So we're going to try to set up Socket IO on the client, which is a React app. First and foremost, you got to make sure that you have installed socket.io-client. Simple as that. That's the only package we're going to need. So I figured it makes sense to handle creating a socket connection on the front end when authentication happens. Seems to make sense. So the authentication logic in this app is handled within a context, which I've called auth context. If you don't know about React context, I suggest that you look into it. It's very handy and it'll definitely help you understand what's going on in this video. So here we have a context file. I'm keeping track of a token in state and user information in state as well. This is really just a decoded version of the token. And that information is getting passed to the provider, which is available to the entire app. And yeah, the handling of the authentication is happening here, and the state of the authentication is being kept here. So here we have the part of the code where the user is actually authenticated, and this is where we want to actually create a socket connection. However, first, we do have to import our socket.io.client. And the way you do that is you say import, and you destructure the IO object, and you say from socket.io.client. And then I also know that I am going to track the socket connection in state so that I can hand it to the entire app through that provider. So I will say const socket and set socket equals use state, and we'll initialize that as null. Okay, so going back down to this part of the code where the user is logged in. On the front end, when you're dealing with Socket IO, you basically always want to be working within a use effect. Creating socket connections, applying listeners, all that kind of stuff should be done within a use effect. It might be a simple use effect with an empty dependency array, but still doing this logic within a use effect allows you to clean up when the component unmounts and disconnect any sockets and remove any listeners that might otherwise linger. I believe Socket IO is actually pretty good about cleaning itself up, but it is good practice to do the cleanup explicitly. Okay, so what does creating a socket connection look like on the front end? Well, we only want to do it if we don't already have a socket connection. So we'll say if bang socket. And remember, socket is our state variable that we're going to be storing our socket connection into eventually. So if we don't already have a socket connection, we're going to create a new one. And here's how we do that. We'll say const, and we'll call it new socket equals IO. So we're calling the IO function, and the first parameter we give it is the URL of our server that we're connecting to, which will be our localhost at 3001. http://localhost:3001. The second argument is not mandatory. In fact, this right here is good enough to create a socket connection. However, I want to do something a little nicer, which Socket.io allows me to do, and that is to specify an auth option. Socket.io allows you to pass along auth information and even specify a token. And so when I create this new socket connection, I'm also going to be passing along my token information as part of the headers of the socket connection. This is how we're going to tie in the user to each socket connection. There are infinite different ways of handling your socket logic. You can, manually take care of managing which user is associated with which socket connection on the server or what have you. But I found that this is a pretty handy way to do it, especially since username, email, ID are embedded in this token. Okay, so we've created a new socket, and now what we want to do is save it into our state. So we say set socket, new socket. So now our socket state variable will contain this socket connection. And so we want that socket connection to be accessible anywhere within our app. And so what we're going to do is simply add it to this list of objects being passed to all the children of this auth provider. This auth context, could now be called auth and socket context, but I'm not going to bother renaming it. Okay, so we've done that. And since I created a socket connection here, I feel that this is actually probably a good place to do the explicit cleanup. So within a use effect, if you return a callback function like this, it will execute when the component unmounts. And so you could do something like if socket.disconnect, which is a method that Socket.io has for disconnecting a socket connection. So this is the cleanup that I was talking about. It's a good practice to utilize. Okay, so we've created a socket connection and we've saved it to the state. We want to start actually doing stuff with this socket connection. What I would do is create another use effect that has the socket in its dependency array. So I would go use effect, and I would create a new one like this. And I'm going to have this one be dependent on the socket. And we'll still check, if there is a socket, because we don't want to try to apply listeners to a socket that doesn't exist yet. We'll get errors if we try to do that. But if we have a socket, then we can start applying listeners to it. And so we would do pretty much exactly what we would do on the back end. Slightly different maybe. But so we'll create an event listener for the connection. On the server, that was called connection. On the front end, it's called connect. Kind of confusing, but it is what it is. So socket.on connect, followed by the callback function of what we want to do when we get a connection. And for now, we're just going to console log. Connected. Well, let's test it. So we placed the logic of creating this new socket right after the authentication takes place. Okay, this is the server console log. Let's have a look at our React app. And sure enough, we did indeed get that console log from our auth context. Cool, so we're connected. We have a socket connection between the client and the server. It's pretty cool. So let me show you how to emit an event. So once we're connected, or once we have a socket, we can start emitting events. So it looks like this, socket.emit. What do I want to call this event? We'll just keep it simple. We'll just call it hello. And that's it. You can add an object as the second argument of this emit function to pass along, some information or what have you, but not always necessary. Sometimes all you need is just an event trigger. And this one's called hello. I made that up. So on the server, we could set up a listener for a hello event. Let's do that. So we go to our server.js. That's where we're stashing all of our listeners. Here we started to, in the previous video, make a listener for a message event, let's create one for that hello event. So we'll say socket.onHello. And what do we want to do when we receive a hello event? We want to say console log. I hear you, client. And then what you can do is emit something back via that very same socket connection. You could say socket.emit, and you could also call it hello. It's not going to create an endless loop. At least we haven't caused it to yet. And so we'll say hello back to the client. So if we go back to the client, we can create a listener for a hello event. So far, all we've done is emitted a hello event, but we could also create a listener for it. So we could say socket.onHello, and then basically in the callback function, do the same thing that we did on the server in console log. I see you, server. Okay, we edited the server a little bit, so I'm going to restart that. And let's check it out. Okay, look at that. We're communicating between client and server. The client is the first one to do the emit of the hello event. The server has the listener for it right here and emits its own hello event. And thus, this listener gets triggered on the front end. Okay, so that's the basic setup of emitting and connecting and whatnot. We want to get this chat app working. Let's do that. So the chat app is located on the home page. So we'll open that up. And here is our home page. We've done a lot of the setup already. We have state variables for the current message being typed in the message input, and an array of messages that are going to be displayed in this box up here. When the user submits their little message, it triggers this function, which so far all it does is clear the message input. We want it to emit an event and send along the message. So let's do that. Well, actually first, our auth context. We're so far only destructuring the user and the set user state functionality. We need to grab a socket. So that's being handed to us from that auth context provider, and now we can access it right here in the home page. So now within this handle send message function, we can do a event emission. And so I will say socket.emit, and this is going to be called message. And we do need to pass along some information here, and that is going to be the variable message, which is a state variable that represents what the user has typed. Okay, and so you may remember there's already an event listener for a message event on the server. It'll console log out a message that gets sent to it. So let's just test this out. We will type yo, and look at that. Beautiful. Okay, so let's take another step towards making this an actual chat app. The goal is we're able to send the message to the server. We want the server to send that message back, and then we'll receive that and display it up here and have it get sent to all users. So all users that are connected will see it show up in their messages box. So the way we do that is we modify our message event listener. We don't just console log it. What we're going to do is we're going to emit it to everybody. And the way to do that is you say io.emit instead of socket.emit. This will emit it to every active socket connection. And so we can call this a message event as well. And for now, we're just going to send that very same message right back to all clients. And so on the homepage, we can set up a message listener. Right now, we've only emitted messages on the homepage. So we have that socket that we're getting from our context, and we're going to set up a use effect to set up a listener. So we go use effect, and we want the dependency of this use effect to be socket, so that we can check when there is a socket, an actual proper socket. And so we'll check if we have a socket that we can apply listeners to, and we'll say socket.on message. So when the server sends out a message like that, we will take that message and we will add it to the messages array. We have a state variable for a messages array, and we can update it with set messages. And so we'll use the functional way of doing that. And I use the word prior to represent the current state or prior state, I guess, of that messages array. And what you can do is just spread out prior and add the new message to the end of it. And since we did modify our server, I'm going to restart the app. Okay, let's see what happens when I type yo now. Look at that. Okay, so before we get too excited, let's open up a new browser profile and we'll navigate to our project here. And I have a user called user1 at user1.com. Okay, and they don't see the yo because they connected after it was sent. In order to see previously sent messages, you'd have to hand them to a database and write logic that does that. This is a very simple chat app. It's only for people that are connected live. Look at that. And now user one can send one back. I meant hi, but we'll go with he. And sure enough, we have a chat app. The final step will be to get it so that the user who sent the messages will be, displayed here. So let's get started on that. You may remember that when we created our socket connections in the context, we attached this token. In order to actually utilize that on the server, we're going to apply some middleware. And I won't spend too much time breaking that down, and I'm going to copy and paste this. So this is middleware. You know what? Let's forego the comment because I can't type right now. Here is the middleware. We're applying middleware to IO on the server. When we use the .use method to apply middleware, the arguments are always going to be the socket as the first and the next method as the second, which is how you basically end the execution of middleware and move on to whatever code comes after the middleware. And so in short, we are able to get this token because we sent it when we created the socket connection. And then since we have JWT installed, although we don't have it imported yet, so let's just do that real quick. We do have to have JWT installed on the back end, or JSON web token rather. Okay, back to the middleware. We can have access to the decoded version of the token, and then we can modify the socket object, give it a user property, and then apply properties to that, such as username. It looks like we're just doing username and ID so far. So now every socket connection will have this, because you won't be able to create a socket connection unless you're an authenticated user. And so if you are, then there will be this information and we can attach it directly to the socket. And so now, when we emit a message, let's see, where do we emit our message? Right here. We could do something a little bit fancier. So here's what we're going to do. When we receive a message, we'll create a variable for the username. We'll say const username equals socket.user.username. So now we have this username. And since we want to provide both the username and the message, we're going to change this into an object. And we'll say username, and we'll go ahead and just type it out. And we will go with message, and that's called MSG at this point. So now we're passing an object with two properties. And so we'll modify our listener for the messages. And instead, we will call this data, since it's now an object rather than just a string. And we can say const message equals data.message. And then we can say const username equals data.username. And then you could, well, let's make a variable for it. Const display message. And we'll use a template literal. And we'll put the username at the very beginning. We'll add a colon and a space, and then we will include the MSG. And then we can just add our display message as such. All right, let's restart our app. Okay. Please work. We'll go with the typo. The username shows up. Who am I? Well, you're user one, of course, because your username is being showed. This is awesome and fun. And yeah, I could keep typing back and forth like that. But now you've gotten a pretty good hang of Socket.io at this point. You've built a chat app. There's a lot more you can do with Socket.io. You can build rooms. You can emit to specific socket connections. There's more to do. So maybe I'll make another video of it. I'm not sure. Maybe we'll talk about rooms and some more of that cool stuff that we can do. But even without that, this is a very good start on making your own Socket.io apps. You can start creating lots and lots of different events and listeners to have something more complex. And at this point, when you're all set up like this, you're just using your own basic logic skills to figure out what you need to do to make your app do what you intended to do. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And as always, happy coding, folks. Take care.